Sometimes the cruelest moments in life become the doorway to everything we never dared to hope for. Every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not judged by what others think they see. In the town of Bitterhook, 18-year-old Tilda Mae had become everyone's favorite target. At the town festival, they decided to auction her off as a joke. But when mountain man Bram Callister stepped forward with real gold, the laughter stopped. He wasn't buying her out of pity. He saw something in Tilda that no one else had bothered to look for. What happens when someone finally sees your worth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bitterhook, a town that had forgotten how to be kind. Built around a dried-up creek bed that once promised prosperity, the settlement had grown hard and bitter like the alkali soil that surrounded it. The wooden buildings leaned against each other as if seeking comfort they couldn't provide. Their paint long since scoured away by wind and disappointment. Tilda Mae pulled her mother's faded blue apron tighter around her generous frame as she made her way to Henley's General Store. The apron, worn thin from years of washing, was one of the few things she had left of her mother, a woman who had died too young, leaving behind only recipes written in careful script and the memory of gentle hands that had never known cruelty. Tilda wore it like armor now, though it offered little protection against the words that followed her down the street. "Look at her waddle," came a voice from the porch of Murphy's saloon, "like a duck heading to water." The laughter that followed was as predictable as sunrise. Tilda kept her eyes fixed on the worn wooden planks beneath her feet, counting her steps. 47 to reach the store. 47 moments of enduring their entertainment before she could disappear inside. At 18, Tilda had learned to make herself invisible in plain sight. She moved through Bitterhook like a ghost haunting her own life, performing the daily ritual of survival under the watchful eyes of people who had decided her worth before she'd learned to speak. Her Aunt Gertrude, a woman whose heart had curdled like milk left too long in the sun, reminded her daily of the burden she represented. "Eating us out of house and home," Gertrude would mutter. Though the house was little more than a leaning shack, and home was wherever Tilda could find a moment's peace. "Your poor mother, God rest her soul, never would have imagined what you'd become." But Tilda remembered her mother differently. Sarah Graver had possessed a quiet strength that could calm a crying baby with a lullaby, or turn the simplest ingredients into a feast that warmed both belly and soul. In the worn recipe book hidden beneath Tilda's thin mattress, her mother's handwriting still spoke of love, measured in pinches of salt and dashes of hope. The bell above Henley's door chimed as Tilda entered, and old Samuel Henley looked up from his ledger with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but wasn't cruel either. He was one of the few people in town who treated her with something approaching human decency, though even his kindness came wrapped in pity. "Morning, Tilda Mae," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent watching good people get ground down by circumstance. "What can I do for you today?" She handed him the list Aunt Gertrude had scrawled on a piece of brown paper. "The usual supplies, Mr. Henley. Aunt Gertrude says to put it on account." Samuel nodded, though they both knew the account was already stretched thinner than winter ice. He moved through the store with practiced efficiency, gathering flour that would make tough biscuits, salt pork that had seen better days, and coffee that was more chicory than bean. As he worked, Tilda allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to shop for ingredients because she wanted to create something beautiful, not just to fill empty stomachs with whatever could be afforded. "That herb garden behind your place," Samuel said quietly as he wrapped the supplies. "I noticed the mint and sage doing well. Your mother had quite the touch with growing things." Tilda nodded, surprised by the warmth that spread through her chest. Someone had noticed. Someone remembered that her mother had been more than just another woman who died too young in a hard town. "I tried to tend it like she did," Tilda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The plants seemed to remember her hands. Samuel paused in his rapping, studying her face with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "You know, there's more of your mother in you than that aunt of yours would have you believe. Sarah Graver was the strongest woman I ever knew, and strength doesn't always show the way folks expect it to." Before Tilda could respond, the door chimed again, and the warmth of the moment shattered like glass hitting stone. 3 young men entered, their laughter preceding them like a warning. Jake Morrison, the banker's son, led the group with the confidence of someone who had never known consequence. Behind him came the Hutchins brothers, twins who shared a single cruel brain between them. "Well, well," Jake said, his voice carrying the practiced drawl of inherited arrogance. "If it isn't our favorite entertainment. Tell me, Tilda Mae, you planning to grace us with your presence at the harvest reckoning? The whole town's been wondering what costume you'll squeeze into this year." The Hutchins brothers snickered like hyenas scenting weakness, and Tilda felt her mother's apron might as well have been made of paper for all the protection it offered. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the grain patterns in the wooden counter. But Jake wasn't finished. "I was telling the boys just yesterday," he continued, warming to his audience, "that we ought to auction off something special this year, something the whole town could bid on for a laugh." Samuel cleared his throat, a sound that carried decades of disapproval. "That's enough, Jake. The girl's done nothing to you. Nothing to us." Jake's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Mr. Henley, she provides us with hours of entertainment just by existing. That's got to be worth something." The words hit Tilda like physical blows, each one finding its mark with practiced precision. She had endured years of this particular torture, but something about Jake's tone today carried an edge that made her stomach clench with dread. There was planning behind his cruelty, a purpose that went beyond the casual meanness she had learned to navigate. "Your supplies are ready," Samuel said firmly, sliding the wrapped goods across the counter. "I'll walk you out, Tilda Mae." But Jake stepped into her path, his smile sharp enough to cut. "No need for that, Mr. Henley. We were just discussing the upcoming festivities. You know how important it is for everyone to participate in community events." The way he said it made participation sound like a threat. Tilda clutched her packages against her chest and tried to step around him, but the Hutchins brothers moved to block the door. The store suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in like a trap. "Jake Morrison." Samuel's voice carried a warning that had served him well in his younger days when he'd been more than just a shopkeeper. "Move aside and let the girl pass." For a moment the tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Jake laughed and stepped back with exaggerated courtesy. "Of course, Mr. Henley, we're all friends here." He tipped his hat to Tilda with mock gallantry. "See you at the festival, Tilda Mae. Wouldn't want you to miss all the excitement." Tilda fled through the door, her cheeks burning with shame and something deeper, a growing certainty that whatever Jake Morrison was planning would be worse than anything she had endured before. Behind her she could hear Samuel's voice raised in anger, but the words were lost beneath the rushing of blood in her ears. The walk home seemed longer than usual, though whether that was due to the weight of her packages or the weight of her dread, she couldn't say. The town watched her progress with the kind of interest reserved for approaching storms. Everyone knew something was coming, but nobody wanted to be the one to warn her. High up in the mountains that ringed Bitterhook like protective walls, another pair of eyes watched the town below. Bram Callister stood on an outcropping of granite, his weathered hands wrapped around a simple wooden cross that had been carved with infinite care and worn smooth by years of handling. The cross bore no inscription, needed none. It marked the grave of dreams that had died with the woman who had given them meaning. Sarah Callister had been dead for 3 years, but the cross remained warm in Bram's hands, as if her spirit still reached across the divide to comfort him. She had been small and fierce, with hair the color of autumn leaves and a laugh that could chase away the darkest winter nights. The fever had taken her and their unborn child in the space of a week, leaving Bram alone in a cabin built for 3 and silence that echoed with might-have-beens. He had been watching the town more often lately, though he couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was the approaching anniversary of Sarah's death, or maybe it was simply the loneliness that had grown too heavy to carry in complete solitude. From his vantage point, Bitterhook looked almost peaceful, its ugliness softened by distance and the golden light of late afternoon. But Bram knew better than to trust appearances. He had grown up in that town, had seen how it treated anything different or weak. The mountain had become his refuge, not just from grief, but from the casual cruelty that passed for entertainment in places where hope had died and left only bitterness behind. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Bram touched the cross to his lips in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Tomorrow was the harvest reckoning, and something in the wind carried the scent of change. He didn't know what drew his eyes so often to the small figure that moved through the town's streets like a ghost seeking peace. But he found himself wondering what strength it took to endure such persistent unkindness. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying prayers and promises to places beyond human understanding. In town, Tilda Mae prepared for another night of pretending sleep would come easy. On the mountain, Bram Callister held a wooden cross and remembered what it felt like to love someone enough to die for them. Neither could know that tomorrow would change. Everything, that the cruel laughter of a bitter town would become the catalyst for something beautiful and unexpected. Sometimes the worst moments in life are just the darkness before dawn, and dawn was coming to Bitterhook whether its people were ready or not. The morning of the harvest reckoning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made even Bitterhook look almost hopeful. The main street had been transformed overnight with bunting and tables laden with preserves, baked goods, and crafts that represented the best efforts of a community trying to remember how to celebrate. Children ran between the stalls with sticky fingers and bright laughter, their joy untainted by the harder realities their parents carried. Tilda Mae stood at the window of her aunt's shack, watching the festivities unfold with the detachment of someone observing a play in which she had no role. She had helped with the preparations. Of course, her strong back and willing hands were useful for moving tables and hanging decorations, but participation and belonging were two different things entirely. "Stop gawking and get yourself ready," Aunt Gertrude snapped from behind her. "People expect to see you there, even if it's just for their own entertainment." The word stung, but Tilda had long since learned that showing pain only encouraged more of it. She turned from the window and smoothed her hands over her best dress, a brown wool that had belonged to her mother and had been let out as much as the fabric would allow. Over it, she tied her mother's blue apron, the familiar weight of it offering what comfort it could. The festival was in full swing when they arrived, the air thick with the scents of roasting corn and apple cider. Tilda tried to stay close to the edges, to make herself small in the crowd, but Jake Morrison's voice cut through the general chatter like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." He had climbed onto the auction platform that was normally used for selling livestock and farm equipment. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone born to command attention. "Before we begin the traditional harvest auction, we have something special planned this year, a new tradition that I think will bring some levity to our celebration." A murmur of curiosity rippled through the crowd, and Tilda felt her stomach drop like a stone into dark water. Whatever Jake had planned, she was at the center of it. She could feel it in the way eyes began to turn toward her, in the way conversations quieted to expectant whispers. "As you all know," Jake continued, his grin widening, "every community has its characters, those special individuals who bring color to our daily lives. And nobody has brought us more entertainment over the years than our own Tilda Mae Graver." The crowd began to understand, and the laughter started like water finding cracks in a dam. Soon it would become a flood, and Tilda would drown in it. She tried to step backward, to disappear into the crowd, but found her way blocked by bodies that had formed an impenetrable wall. "So I thought to myself," Jake went on, his voice rising over the growing laughter, What better way to show our appreciation than to auction off the privilege of Tilda Mae's company for the evening? Think of it. Someone gets to escort our most distinguished lady to the harvest dance, and we all get to witness the spectacle. The leather gold pouch appeared in Jake's hand as if by magic, but Tilda knew it contained nothing more valuable than bottle caps and bent nails. The auction was just another layer of the joke. Men would bid with worthless tokens, and the winner would claim a prize that everyone understood to be punishment rather than privilege. "Do I hear opening bids?" Jake called out, and the crowd roared its approval. 2 buttons and a rusty nail. Someone shouted from the back, "A handful of pebbles and my wife's worst cornbread." He called another. The bids grew increasingly ridiculous, each one drawing fresh waves of laughter. Tilda stood frozen in the center of it all, her mother's apron clutched in her fists like a lifeline. The faces around her blurred together, neighbors who had watched her grow up, people who had accepted her mother's kindness and her father's hard work. Now united in their cruel entertainment, she closed her eyes and tried to disappear inside herself, to find the quiet place where her mother's voice still lived and cruelty couldn't follow. But Jake's voice penetrated even that sanctuary. "Come now, surely someone can do better than bottle caps and broken promises. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, folks. I'll bid a handful of acorns and a dead fish." The Hutchins brothers were getting into the spirit of things, their bid drawing applause from the crowd. Tilda opened her eyes and found herself looking directly at Samuel Henley. The old shopkeeper's face was tight with disgust, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might speak up, might put an end to this nightmare. But what could one old man do against an entire town bent on its entertainment? "Going once, going twice." Jake raised his gavel with theatrical flourish. The sound that stopped him wasn't loud, just the soft thunk of leather hitting wood. But it cut through the laughter like a gunshot, bringing absolute silence to the crowded street. On the auction platform, next to Jake's worthless tokens, sat a leather pouch that bulged with the weight of real gold. The crowd turned as one, following the path of that pouch back to its source. He stood at the edge of the festivities, like a figure from another world, taller than any man had a right to be, with shoulders broad enough to carry mountains and eyes that held the kind of stillness that came from years of solitude. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who had learned to read the sky like scripture. Bram Callister had not been seen in Bitterhook for 3 years. Some had whispered that he had died up on his mountain, alone with his grief and his ghosts. Others claimed he had gone wild, become more beast than man in his isolation. But here he stood, solid and real and utterly calm, in the face of their shocked silence. "I bid gold," he said, his voice carrying easily across the square despite its quiet tone. "Real gold for the lady's company." Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. This was not part of his carefully planned humiliation. The crowd pressed closer, necks craning to see the pouch that had materialized like something from a fairy tale. That is," Jake stammered, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Mr. Callister, this is just a bit of fun, not a looked real enough when you called for bids," Bram said, stepping through the crowd that parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. "A man's word is his bond. Isn't that what you always said, Jake Morrison?" The mountain man's eyes found Tilda across the distance, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not pity, not charity, but recognition. He was looking at her the way her mother had looked at wounded birds, with a mixture of gentleness and absolute determination to see them fly again. "The gold is real," Bram continued, his gaze never leaving Tilda's face. "The bid is real. The lady has been auctioned, and I am the highest bidder." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of mountains and the promise of shelter. "She's coming with me." The crowd erupted in confused babble, some protesting, others asking questions, all trying to understand how their entertainment had become something else entirely. But Tilda heard none of it. She was focused on the man who had stepped out of the wilderness to claim her, not as a joke or a burden or a source of amusement, but as something valuable enough to pay gold for. Bram walked toward her with steady purpose, and with each step, the laughter died a little more. When he reached her, he extended his hand, calloused from honest work, steady as stone. "Miss Graver," he said formally, as if they were meeting at a church social instead of in the midst of the town's cruelest joke. "If you're willing, I'd be honored to have your company." Tilda stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would change everything. Behind her lay a life of mockery and small cruelties, of making herself invisible and enduring what couldn't be changed. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the possibility of something she had almost forgotten existed: dignity. She took his hand. The crowd fell silent as Bram helped her onto the wagon that waited at the edge of the square. Her few belongings, hastily gathered by Aunt Gertrude, who seemed as stunned as everyone else, were already loaded in the back. As they pulled away from Bitterhook, Tilda looked back once at the faces she had known all her life. They were no longer laughing. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they climbed the winding mountain road, each turn taking them further from Bitterhook and deeper into country that seemed untouched by human cruelty. Tilda sat rigid on the wagon seat, her small bundle of belongings clutched in her lap like a shield. Inside the cloth wrapping were her mother's recipe book, a few items of clothing, and the faded tin-type photograph that showed her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, with no idea of the sorrows that waited ahead. Bram Callister guided the horses with easy competence, his large hands gentle on the reins. He had not spoken since they left the town square, and Tilda found herself stealing glances at his profile, trying to understand what manner of man paid gold for someone everyone else considered worthless. His face revealed nothing, just the same calm stillness that had faced down an entire town's mockery without flinching. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Tilda had spent her life being invisible, but now she felt exposed under the open sky, uncertain of her place in this strange new chapter of her existence. What did he expect from her? What debts came attached to his golden coins? "I don't understand," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the creak of the wagon and the clip-clop of horse hooves on stone. Bram glanced at her, his eyes the color of winter pine needles. "What don't you understand?" "Why?" The word came out smaller than she intended. "Why you paid for me? Why you took me away from—" She gestured helplessly toward the valley below, where Bitterhook sat like a scab on the landscape. He was quiet for so long that Tilda thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were testing each one before releasing it. "No person should be made sport of like that," he said. "Your mother was a good woman. She deserved better than to have her daughter treated like a carnival curiosity." Tilda's throat tightened. "You knew my mother." "Sarah Graver was kind to my wife when we first came to these parts. She brought soup when my wife was poorly, and never asked for anything in return." Bram's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Good people deserve better than what that town offers." They crested a rise, and Tilda gasped despite herself. The valley that spread below them was nothing like the harsh country around Bitterhook. Here the mountains embraced a meadow, where wildflowers painted the grass in brilliant colors, and a stream wound through it all like a silver ribbon catching the afternoon light. At the far end of the meadow sat a cabin that looked like something from a storybook. Solid timber walls, a stone chimney trailing wood smoke, and windows that reflected the sky like welcoming eyes. "It's beautiful," Tilda breathed. "It's peaceful," Bram corrected. But she caught the hint of pride in his voice. "Built it with my own hands. Every log, every stone." As they drew closer, Tilda could see the care that had gone into the homestead. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with a wide front porch and flower boxes beneath the windows. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop and a vegetable garden that showed the signs of careful tending. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work and found comfort in creating order from wilderness. Bram helped her down from the wagon with the same careful courtesy he had shown in town, and Tilda found herself standing in a yard where no one had ever laughed at her, where no cruel words had ever been spoken. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of enduring mockery. This was the peaceful silence of a sanctuary. "I'll show you inside," Bram said, lifting her bundle from the wagon bed. "We can talk about arrangements once you've had a chance to settle." The interior of the cabin was as carefully crafted as the exterior. The main room centered around a massive stone fireplace, with comfortable furniture arranged to catch both warmth and the light from the windows. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that suggested a man of deeper thoughts than his rough exterior might indicate. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was a loneliness to it that spoke of meals eaten in solitude and conversations held only with the wind. "There's a room upstairs," Bram said, gesturing toward a wooden staircase. "It was meant to be. Well, it's clean and private. You'll have your own space." Tilda followed him up the narrow stairs to a small but comfortable room with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the meadow. It was more luxury than she had known in years, and the kindness of it brought tears to her eyes. "I don't know how to repay you," she said quietly. Bram set her bundle on the bed and turned to face her. "You don't owe me anything. What happened in town was wrong, and I had the means to put a stop to it. That's all." But Tilda could see deeper currents in his expression, shadows that spoke of losses and loneliness that matched her own. "There must be something I can do. I'm not afraid of work. We'll figure that out as we go," Bram said. "For now, just rest. Get your bearings. This has been a difficult day." He left her alone in the room, and Tilda sank onto the bed, the first real bed she had called her own since her mother's death. Through the window, she could see Bram moving around the yard, tending to the horses with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything in his domain. She unwrapped her bundle and placed her few possessions around the room, trying to make it feel like home. Her mother's recipe book fell open to a page near the front, where Sarah Graver had written in her careful script, "The secret ingredient in any dish is the love you put into it. Feed people's hearts as well as their bodies, and you'll never go hungry for company." Tilda traced the familiar handwriting with one finger, wondering if her mother would approve of the choice she had made. Leaving with a strange man might have been reckless, but staying in Bitterhook would have been slow death by 1,000 small cuts. At least here, in this peaceful valley, she had a chance to discover what lay beneath the surface of Tilda Mae Graver. As evening approached, the smell of cooking food drifted up from the kitchen below. Bram was preparing supper, and Tilda realized she had not eaten since early morning. Her stomach growled, reminding her that dignity was all well and good, but a person still needed sustenance. She made her way downstairs to find Bram at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven and looked like it could feed half of Bitterhook. He glanced up as she entered, and she saw something in his expression that she had almost forgotten existed. Simple human kindness, offered without expectation of return. "Thought you might be hungry," he said. "It's not fancy, but it's filling." Tilda moved closer to the stove, drawn by the warmth and the promise of a meal shared without mockery. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of tomorrow might hold something better than today. "It smells wonderful," she said, and meant it. The first light of dawn filtered through the cabin windows, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Tilda woke in the narrow bed that had given her the first peaceful night's sleep she'd known in years, momentarily disoriented by the absence of her aunt's sharp voice or the sound of neighbors discussing her shortcomings through thin walls. Here, the only sounds were birdsong and the gentle whisper of wind through pine needles. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and something wonderful cooking on the stove. Bram stood at the kitchen hearth, tending a pan of eggs and salt pork with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. He looked up as she entered, nodding a quiet greeting. "Morning," he said simply. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years," Tilda admitted, then blushed at the honesty in her own voice. In Bitterhook, such admissions were weapons that could be turned against you later, but Bram just nodded as if her peace mattered to him. "Mountain air helps, and quiet. Amazing what a person can heal when they're not fighting battles every day." He served her a plate that held more food than she typically saw in a week. Eggs cooked perfectly, meat that wasn't gristle and desperation, and bread that had been baked with skill rather than duty. Tilda ate slowly, savoring flavors that reminded her of childhood meals when her mother's love had seasoned every dish. "This is wonderful," she said, and Bram's weathered face showed the faintest hint of pleasure. "Sarah, my wife, she taught me the basics before she passed. Said a man needed to know how to feed himself properly if he wanted to keep body and soul together." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife directly, and Tilda could see the careful way he held the memory, like something precious that might shatter if handled roughly. She wanted to ask more, but some instinct warned her that grief had its own timeline, and pushing would only cause him to retreat behind his walls of silence. Instead, she looked around the kitchen with new eyes, noting the well-organized shelves, the herbs hanging in neat bundles from the rafters, and the massive hearth that dominated one wall like an altar to domestic comfort. Everything spoke of careful planning and skilled hands, but also of a deep loneliness that no amount of organization could fill. "I could help," she offered quietly. "With the cooking, I mean. My mother taught me her recipes before she died. I'm not afraid of work." Bram studied her face as if weighing something important. "You don't need to earn your keep here, Miss Graver. What I did in town wasn't a purchase, it was just stopping something that should have been stopped." "I know that," Tilda said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "But I've been useless for so long I'd forgotten what it feels like to have hands that can create, instead of just endure. Please, let me contribute something." After a moment, Bram nodded. "If it would make you feel better. Lord knows this place could use a woman's touch in the kitchen." And so began Tilda's transformation from burden to partner. She discovered that the herbs growing in careful rows behind the cabin were of better quality than anything she had ever worked with in town. Her mother's recipes, adapted to mountain ingredients and Bram's generous pantry, became meals that filled the cabin with warmth and the kind of contentment that comes from shared purpose. The kitchen hearth became her domain, its massive stone construction perfect for the slow cooking that turned tough mountain game into tender sustenance. She learned to bake bread in the Dutch oven, to smoke fish from the stream that ran behind the property, and to preserve the abundance of vegetables from Bram's garden. Each successful dish felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been buried under years of mockery. Bram, for his part, proved to be a respectful and appreciative audience for her efforts. He complimented her cooking without condescension, offered suggestions based on his knowledge of local ingredients, and slowly began to share stories of the land and its seasons. She learned that he had been born in these mountains, that his family had carved their first cabin from wilderness 3 generations ago, and that he understood the rhythms of this place the way some men understood books. "Winter comes early here," he explained one evening, as they shared a supper of venison stew and fresh bread. "Sometimes the snow starts in October and doesn't quit until May. A person needs to be prepared, needs to know how to live with the land instead of fighting it." Tilda nodded, already thinking about the preparations that would be needed. Root cellars to stock, meat to preserve, firewood to cut and stack. The work would be hard, but it would be work with purpose, survival instead of mere endurance. "I want to learn," she said. "Everything you can teach me about living here. I don't ever want to go back to being helpless." Something shifted in Bram's expression, a recognition that went deeper than mere approval. "You were never helpless, Miss Graver. Helpless people don't survive what you survived with their hearts still capable of kindness." The words hit her like a physical blow, but a good one, the kind of impact that reshaped something that had been bent out of true. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away, not from shame this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen clearly by someone whose opinion mattered. Their days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Bram would rise before dawn to tend his animals and check his traps, while Tilda prepared breakfast and planned the day's cooking. They worked together on larger projects, splitting wood, mending fences, preparing the cabin for winter, with the easy cooperation of people who understood that survival was a partnership, not a competition. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Bram reading from his small collection of books, while Tilda worked on mending or simple needlework. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but filled instead with the peaceful quiet of shared purpose. Tilda found herself changing in ways both subtle and profound. Her shoulders straightened as she went about her daily tasks. Her voice grew stronger when she spoke to Bram, no longer whispering as if afraid to take up space in the world. She began to look forward to each new day instead of simply enduring it. Most remarkably, she began to laugh again. Small chuckles at first when Bram told dry stories about his encounters with stubborn livestock, then fuller laughter as she rediscovered the joy that had been buried under years of defensive silence. The sound surprised them both the first time it echoed through the cabin, but Bram's answering smile suggested it was a sound the place had been waiting to hear. As autumn deepened and the first frost touched the high meadows, Tilda realized she had not thought about Bitterhook in weeks. October brought the first snow to the high peaks, and with it a restlessness that seemed to settle into Bram's bones. Tilda noticed it in the way he would pause in his work to stare at the mountains, his weathered hands clenched at his sides as if fighting some invisible battle. She saw it in the careful way he avoided certain parts of the cabin, particularly the small room behind the kitchen that he kept locked and never mentioned. The change had come gradually, like shadow creeping across a sundial. For weeks, they had found their rhythm together, working, cooking, sharing quiet conversations by the fire. But now, as winter approached and the anniversary of some unnamed sorrow drew closer, Bram began to retreat behind walls that no amount of gentle coaxing could breach. Tilda had learned to read the signs. The way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking. The manner in which he would begin a story, then stop abruptly as if the words had become too heavy to carry. Most telling of all was how his eyes would sometimes focus on something she couldn't see. His expression holding the kind of pain that comes from loving someone who can never love you back. It was while cleaning the main room that she found the first clue. A small wooden box had fallen behind the heavy oak dresser, and when she retrieved it, the lid came open in her hands. Inside, nestled in faded blue silk, lay a woman's wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin by years of wear, engraved with intertwining roses that spoke of promises made in better times. Tilda stared at the ring, understanding flooding through her like cold water. This was why Bram lived alone on his mountain. This was the source of the careful distance he maintained, even in their growing friendship. Someone had worn this ring, had shared his bed and his dreams, and now she was gone. The sound of Bram's boots on the front porch sent Tilda scrambling to return the box to its hiding place, but her hands shook with the weight of newfound knowledge. When he entered the cabin, she was back at her tasks, but the atmosphere between them had shifted in ways neither could ignore. "You're quiet today," Bram observed, hanging his hat on its peg by the door. "Just thinking," Tilda replied, not trusting herself to meet his eyes. But Bram had not survived years of solitude without learning to read the subtle signs of human emotion. He moved closer, his presence filling the room with the scent of pine needles and honest work. "What's troubling you?" The direct question caught Tilda off guard. In Bitterhook, people had asked such things only to gather ammunition for future cruelty. But Bram's voice held genuine concern, and she found herself responding with an honesty that surprised them both. "You loved someone," she said quietly. "Someone who isn't here anymore." The silence that followed was so complete that Tilda could hear her own heartbeat. Bram stood perfectly still, his face a careful mask that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains. "Sarah," he said, the name falling between them like a stone into still water. "My wife. She died 3 years ago come Christmas." Tilda turned to face him fully, seeing past his careful control to the raw grief that lived just beneath the surface. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." "You didn't pry." Bram moved to the window, staring out at the mountains that had witnessed his joy and his sorrow. "I just don't talk about it much. Talking doesn't bring her back." "No," Tilda agreed softly. "But holding it all inside doesn't honor her memory either." Bram's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Tilda thought she had pushed too hard. But then he turned back to her, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. A willingness to trust her with the parts of himself he kept locked away. "She was small," he said, the words coming slowly, as if he were learning to speak them again. "Smaller than you, with hair like autumn leaves, and a laugh that could chase away the darkest winter nights. She came here as a bride, city-raised but willing to learn mountain ways. Never complained about the isolation, never made me feel like I was asking too much of her." Tilda listened without interruption, understanding that this was sacred ground, memories that had been held in solitude for too long. "Growing heavier with each passing season, we were going to have a child," Bram continued, his voice growing rougher. "She was 6 months along when the fever came. I rode to town for the doctor, but the storm had washed out the bridge. By the time I got back," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You lost them both," Tilda said gently. Bram nodded, his composure finally cracking. "Both of them. In 1 week I went from having everything to having nothing. This cabin that was built for a family became a tomb, and I became the ghost haunting it." The raw honesty of his words broke something open in Tilda's chest. She had thought her own losses were profound, but they paled beside the magnitude of what Bram had endured. To have love and hope and future, only to watch it all slip away while winter storms raged outside, she couldn't imagine surviving such devastation. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked quietly. "Because you understood what it felt like to be lost?" Bram considered the question with the careful thought he gave to all important matters. "Maybe partly, but mostly because you reminded me of her, not in looks, but in strength." Sarah had that same quiet courage, that ability to endure what couldn't be changed, and find ways to make things better anyway. The comparison brought tears to Tilda's eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from being seen and valued for qualities she had almost forgotten she possessed. "She sounds wonderful." Tilda said she was. Bram's voice held both sadness and a fierce pride. "She made this place a home instead of just a house. Everything here bears her touch. The flower boxes, the herb garden, the way the furniture is arranged to catch the morning light. Sometimes I think I can still hear her humming while she works." They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, the ghosts of the past settling between them without malice. Tilda understood now why Bram had been so careful with her, why he maintained such respectful distance even as their friendship deepened. He was not ready to love again, might never be ready, and she was learning to accept that truth without resentment. But understanding his grief also helped her understand her own transformation. In this cabin built for love, surrounded by the evidence of a woman who had found joy in mountain solitude, Tilda was discovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of mockery and shame. She was becoming someone Sarah Callister might have recognized, a woman capable of creating warmth and beauty even in the wilderness. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For trusting me with her memory. For letting me be part of this place, even if I can't fill the space she left behind." Bram's weathered face softened, and when he spoke, his words carried a gentleness that reminded Tilda why she had taken his hand that day in the town square. "You're not trying to fill her space," he said. "You're making your own." The discovery came by accident, as the most profound discoveries often do. Tilda had been searching the workshop behind the cabin for nails to repair a loose board on the chicken coop when her foot caught on something hidden beneath a tarp in the corner. When she pulled the heavy canvas away, her breath caught in her throat. There, carved with exquisite care from mountain pine, sat a cradle. But this was no ordinary piece of furniture. It was a masterwork of love and hope, with delicate roses carved along the curved sides and rockers shaped to provide the gentlest motion. Every surface had been sanded smooth as silk, and the wood glowed with the kind of patina that came from countless hours of patient attention. Tilda knelt beside it, running her fingers along the intricate carvings. She could see Bram's strong hands shaping each curve. Imagine him working by lamplight through long winter evenings, crafting something beautiful for the child who would never sleep within its protective embrace. The cradle was unfinished, the bottom still rough-hewn, the final varnishing never applied, frozen in time like everything else that had died with Sarah Callister. The workshop door creaked behind her, and Tilda turned to find Bram silhouetted in the doorway. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, pain, and finally a weary resignation that broke her heart. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said quietly. "I was looking for nails," Tilda explained, though they both knew the discovery had been inevitable. In a partnership based on honesty and shared work, secrets had a way of revealing themselves. Bram stepped into the workshop, moving slowly as if the cradle might disappear if he approached too quickly. "I started it the day Sarah told me about the baby. Worked on it every evening after supper, planning out each detail. She would sit by the fire with her sewing, and we'd talk about what our child would be like, what we'd teach them about living in these mountains." He knelt beside the cradle, his weathered hands hovering over the carved roses without quite touching them. "I was going to finish it after the birth, after we knew if we had a son or daughter. There were other details I wanted to add, maybe the child's name, or a blessing carved along the headrail." Tilda could see the dreams that had shaped each careful cut, the future that had guided every delicate curve. This cradle represented more than lost love. It embodied lost possibilities, the family that would never gather around the cabin's hearth, the children who would never learn mountain wisdom at their father's knee. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's unfinished." Bram's voice carried a bitterness that had been absent from their earlier conversation about Sarah. "Like everything else I touched back then, I had such plans for the baby, for expanding the cabin, for teaching my son or daughter everything my father taught me. Now it's just another piece of evidence that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes." The pain in his words was so raw that Tilda felt it like a physical wound. She understood now why he had wrapped himself in solitude, why he approached any hint of future planning with such careful reserve. Hope had betrayed him once, and he was not eager to give it another chance to break his heart. "Sarah wouldn't want you to stop living because she couldn't stay," Tilda said gently. Bram's hands clenched into fists. "How do you know what Sarah would want? You never met her." The sharp tone might have sent the old Tilda scurrying for cover, but the woman she was becoming had learned the difference between genuine anger and pain, striking out blindly for something to blame. She stayed where she was, meeting his hurt with steady compassion. "You're right, I never met her. But I know what kind of woman loves a man like you, and I know what kind of woman creates the warmth that still lives in this cabin 3 years after she's gone. Sarah loved you enough to follow you into mountain solitude. Do you really think she'd want that love to become a prison that keeps you from ever caring about anyone again?" Bram stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, grief, and something that might have been recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let go. I don't know how to love someone without being terrified that I'll lose them too." The confession hung between them, like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. Tilda felt the weight of it, the trust implicit in such raw honesty. Here was the heart of Bram's careful distance, the reason he held himself apart, even as their friendship deepened into something that felt like family. "Maybe letting go isn't the answer," Tilda said carefully. "Maybe the answer is holding on to what was beautiful while still being open to what might be beautiful tomorrow." She reached out and touched the carved roses on the cradle's side, revealing the love that had guided their creation. This represents hope, Bram. Not just the hope you had then, but proof that you're capable of hoping at all. That's not something to hide away and regret. It's something to treasure and maybe, someday, build upon. Bram followed her gaze to the unfinished cradle, seeing it perhaps for the first time as something other than a monument to failure.
I used to dream about rocking my child to sleep in this.
About teaching them to carve, to read the weather, to understand that the mountains are harsh but fair if you treat them with respect. Those are still good dreams, Tilda said softly. Different from what you planned, maybe, but no less worthy. Something shifted in Bram's expression, not healing exactly, but the beginning of possibility. For months now, Tilda had been transforming under the gentle influence of his respectful kindness. Perhaps it was time for him to allow her strength to work some healing magic in return. I don't know if I can finish it, he admitted. Every time I pick up the tools, I remember what I was working toward, what I lost. Then maybe it doesn't need to be finished the way you originally planned. Tilda stood, brushing sawdust from her skirts. Maybe it can become something different. Not abandoned, but transformed, like both of us have been transformed as they left the workshop together. Tilda caught Bram glancing back at the cradle with an expression she had not seen before. Not the desperate hope that had carved those roses, nor the bitter resignation that had hidden them under canvas, but something quieter and more sustainable. The fragile beginning of acceptance, and perhaps even the distant possibility of new dreams. That night, as they sat by the fire in comfortable silence, Tilda found herself thinking about transformation and the strange ways that love could multiply rather than diminish when shared. She had come to this mountain as someone discarded, and Bram had welcomed her as someone worthy of protection. Now perhaps she could offer him something in return, not a replacement for what he had lost, but a reason to believe that beauty could grow from the ashes of sorrow. Outside, the first real storm of winter began to build in the peaks, but inside the cabin, warmth prevailed. The delegation from Bitterhook arrived on a crisp November morning, their horses steaming in the cold air as they crested the ridge overlooking Bram's peaceful valley. Tilda saw them first from the kitchen window, 6 men on horseback, led by Jake Morrison and flanked by his father, the town's banker, along with Sheriff Hendrick and 3 other prominent citizens. Their faces held the grim determination of men on a righteous mission. And Tilda's blood turned to ice in her veins. "Bram," she called, her voice tight with alarm. He appeared at her side within moments, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a man who had learned to read danger in the mountain wilderness. His jaw tightened as he recognized the riders, and his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that hung above the mantel. "Stay inside," he told her quietly. "Whatever they want, let me handle it." But Tilda shook her head, surprising them both with her sudden fierceness. "No, I'm done hiding from them. Whatever Jake Morrison thinks he's accomplishing by coming here, he's going to face us both." The riders approached the cabin with theatrical solemnity, as if they were carrying out some grave duty rather than pursuing a petty grudge. They dismounted in military precision, their boots crunching on the frost-covered ground as they formed a semicircle before the front porch. Bram stepped outside first, his massive frame filling the doorway like a natural barrier between the visitors and whatever they imagined they had come to protect. Tilda followed, standing close enough to feel his strength but separate enough to make her own statement. "Morrison," Bram acknowledged with a nod that held no warmth. "Gentlemen, to what do I owe the pleasure of your company?" Jake Morrison stepped forward, his chest puffed with borrowed authority. He held a piece of paper in his hand, official-looking, with seals and signatures that were meant to intimidate. "Bram Callister, we've come on behalf of the good citizens of Bitterhook to address a matter of grave concern." Jake's voice carried the pompous tone of a man who had practiced this speech in front of a mirror. "It has come to our attention that you have, through means both irregular and suspicious, removed one of our community members from her rightful place among her family and neighbors. Tilda felt the words like physical blows. They were trying to paint her rescue as kidnapping, her salvation as a crime. The familiar shame tried to rise in her throat, but she pushed it down with newfound strength. Tilda Mae Graver, Sheriff Hendrick added, his voice heavy with manufactured sympathy, was clearly not in her right mind when she left with you. The shock of that public humiliation, the confusion. A vulnerable young woman might make any number of poor decisions under such circumstances. I was in perfect command of my faculties, Tilda said clearly, her voice carrying across the valley with surprising authority. I made my choice freely, and I don't regret it. Jake Morrison's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Miss Graver, we understand that mountain isolation and, shall we say, improper influences might have confused your thinking. But we're here to rectify that situation, to bring you home where you belong, where proper Christian people can look after your welfare. The hypocrisy of it nearly stole Tilda's breath. These same proper Christian people had made sport of her humiliation, had auctioned her off like livestock for their entertainment. Now they wrapped their cruelty in righteousness and called it rescue. This is her home now, Bram said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of mountains and deep water. She chose to come here and she chooses to stay. Your business is finished, but Jake wasn't ready to retreat so easily. He unfolded the official paper with theatrical flourish. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Mr. Callister. You see, we've obtained a legal order questioning the validity of this arrangement. A single man living in isolation with an unmarried woman of questionable mental capacity. Will that raise his concerns about propriety, about exploitation, about what really happens in this remote location where no decent people can observe and intervene if necessary? The insinuation hung in the air like poison, and Tilda saw red creep up Bram's neck. She stepped forward before he could respond, her voice ringing with a strength she had never known she possessed. How dare you, she said, each word sharp as broken glass. How dare you come here with your false concern and your twisted righteousness? For 18 years I lived in your town, and not one of you showed me a moment's genuine kindness. You made me your entertainment, your favorite target for cruel laughter. And now, when I've finally found peace and dignity, you want to drag me back to be your victim again. Miss Graver, Sheriff Hendrick began, but Tilda cut him off. No, you listen to me. All of you. I'm not a child, not damaged goods, not a burden to be shifted around for other people's convenience. I'm a grown woman who made a choice, the first real choice of my adult life, and you have no right to question it. Jake Morrison's facade cracked slightly. The law says differently. An unmarried woman living alone with a man in such circumstances, it's simply not proper. Not legal, in fact, without the sanction of marriage or family oversight. The word hung between them, like a challenge, and Tilda felt the world shift on its axis. Marriage. It had never occurred to her that their arrangement might be seen through such a lens, but she could see the legal trap being constructed around them. In the eyes of the law, their household could indeed be seen as improper, regardless of the respect and care that actually governed their relationship. She looked at Bram, seeing her own realization reflected in his eyes. They had built something beautiful in their mountain sanctuary, but the outside world would always see it through the distorted lens of assumption and prejudice. Then marry me, Bram said quietly. The words seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. He looked at Tilda with an expression that held shock, determination, and something deeper, a recognition that their partnership had already become something that transcended simple friendship. Marry me, he repeated, his voice growing stronger. Here now before these witnesses. Make it legal and proper so they can't question your right to choose your own life. Tilda stared at him, her heart pounding with the magnitude of what he was offering. Not a marriage of passion. They both understood that, but something perhaps more precious, a marriage of mutual respect, of genuine care of two wounded souls choosing to face the future together. Bram, she whispered, you don't have to. I want to, he said, and the truth of it rang in his voice. I want you to be safe, to be protected, to never have to face their cruelty again. If marriage is what it takes, then that's what we'll do. The delegation shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Jake Morrison's carefully prepared argument was crumbling before their eyes. "You can't be serious," he blustered. "A hasty marriage performed under duress. There's no duress here except what you brought with you," Bram said calmly. "Sheriff Hendrick, you're authorized to perform marriages in emergency circumstances, are you not?" The sheriff nodded reluctantly, caught between his duty to uphold the law and his participation in what was clearly a harassment campaign. "Then perform one now," Bram continued. "Witness our vows, make it official, and settle this question once and for all." Tilda looked into Bram's eyes and saw not desperation, but determination. Not sacrifice, but choice. He was offering her more than legal protection. He was offering partnership, permanence, and the promise that she would never again have to face the world's cruelty alone. "Yes," she said clearly, loud enough for all to hear. "I'll marry you, Bram Callister. Gladly and freely, with no coercion except my own desire for a life built on respect instead of ridicule." The marriage document was hastily drawn up on paper from Bram's own stores, witnessed by men who had come to break up their household and ended up sanctioning it instead. The ceremony was brief, the words simple, but the promises made held the weight of mountains. As Sheriff Hendrick pronounced them husband and wife, Tilda felt something shift inside her chest, not just legal status, but identity itself. She was no longer Tilda Mae Graver, the town's favorite victim. She was Tilda Callister, mountain woman, partner to a man who had seen her worth when no one else would. The delegation rode away in frustrated defeat. Their mission not just failed, but spectacularly backfired. As their horses disappeared over the ridge, Tilda turned to face her new husband, suddenly uncertain in a way she hadn't been moments before. "What have we done?" she asked softly. Bram smiled, the first truly happy expression she had ever seen on his weathered face. "We've made ourselves a family," he said. "Unconventional maybe, but real. And legal enough that no one can question your right to be here ever again." Winter settled over the mountain valley like a benediction, wrapping Bram and Tilda's newly consecrated union in pristine silence and crystalline beauty. The snow began in earnest 3 days after their impromptu wedding, falling in thick, lazy flakes that transformed their world into something that belonged more in a fairy tale than the harsh reality of mountain survival. Their marriage had changed things between them in ways both subtle and profound. They still maintained separate sleeping quarters, a respectful distance that honored the circumstances of their union. But there was a new ease in their daily interactions, a sense of permanent partnership that had not existed before legal vows made their commitment official. Tilda found herself humming as she worked in the kitchen, her mother's old songs filling the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the blazing hearth. She had never been happier, and the transformation showed in everything, from her confident posture to the way she met Bram's eyes, without flinching when he complimented her cooking or thanked her for some small kindness. Bram, for his part, seemed lighter somehow, as if the act of choosing partnership over solitude had lifted a burden he had carried for too long. He smiled more often, lingered over their shared meals instead of wolfing down his food in solitary haste, and began to share stories of his childhood in these mountains with an openness that would have been impossible just months before. "My grandfather used to say that winter was when the mountains tested your character," he told her one evening as they sat before the fire, she with her mending and he with his whittling. "Summer was for building and planning and working toward goals. But winter was for discovering what you were really made of." Tilda looked up from the sock she was darning, noting the way firelight played across Bram's weathered features. "What do you think he would say about us? About what we've built here?" Bram considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "I think he'd say we passed the test. Two people who could have given up on life instead chose to build something meaningful together. That takes the kind of character the mountains respect." It was during one of these peaceful evenings that the first troubling news reached them. Samuel Henley arrived on snowshoes, his face grim, despite his obvious relief at finding them both well. "I wanted to warn you," he said without preamble, accepting the hot coffee Tilda pressed into his hands with grateful nods. "There's talk in town, bad talk. Jake Morrison hasn't gotten over being made to look the fool, and he's been stirring up sentiment against you both." Bram's expression darkened. "What kind of sentiment?" "The worst kind," Samuel replied heavily. "He's been telling anyone who'll listen that the marriage was a sham, performed under duress, to cover up improper relations. Says a proper investigation would reveal the truth of what really goes on up here in isolation." Tilda felt ice form in her stomach. "What does that mean exactly?" Samuel looked uncomfortable, as if the very words left a bad taste in his mouth. "He's talking about petitioning the territorial authorities. Claims that a vulnerable woman has been coerced into an illegal marriage to hide evidence of compromising circumstances." The euphemism hung heavy in the air, its implications clear. Jake Morrison was attempting to destroy her reputation, and Bram's with accusations that would be impossible to definitively disprove and devastating even if proven false. "Let him talk," Bram said quietly. But Tilda could see the tension in his shoulders. "We know the truth. Truth doesn't always matter when lies are more interesting," Samuel warned. "And Jake's got his father's money behind him now. The bankers talking about the need to protect the moral fabric of the community and ensure proper Christian oversight of vulnerable citizens." Tilda set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "They're not going to stop, are they? No matter how legally proper our marriage, no matter how respectably we conduct ourselves, they'll keep coming after us because I dared to escape their cruelty." Samuel's weathered face creased with sympathy. "I'm afraid you might be right, girl. Some people can't abide seeing their victims find happiness. It makes them question their own behavior, and most folks would rather attack what challenges them than examine their own conscience." That night, after Samuel had departed for the dangerous journey back to town, Bram and Tilda sat in thoughtful silence before the dying fire. The peace they had built seemed suddenly fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. "We could leave," Bram said finally. "Pack up, head further into the mountains, or maybe try our luck in Colorado. Start fresh where no one knows our history." Tilda shook her head with surprising firmness. "No, this is our home, our life. We built something beautiful here, and I'm not going to let Jake Morrison's spite drive us away from it." "It might not be a matter of choice," Bram pointed out gently. "If the territorial authorities get involved, if they decide to investigate, then we'll face them," Tilda interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that surprised them both. "Together. As husband and wife, legally wed and lawfully joined. We have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of." Bram studied her face in the firelight, seeing not the frightened girl who had been auctioned off as a joke, but a woman who had found her strength and was prepared to defend what mattered to her. "You've changed," he said softly. "We both have." Tilda reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the first time she had initiated such contact. "You saved me from their cruelty, Bram. But more than that, you helped me remember who I really am, underneath all those years of being told I was worthless. I'm not the same person who got on your wagon that day." "No," Bram agreed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "You're not. You're stronger than I ever imagined when I first saw you standing in that crowd." The conversation that followed was one they had been avoiding, dancing around the edges of deeper feelings that had grown between them like wildflowers in unexpected soil. Neither had planned for love to enter their arrangement, but respect and partnership had gradually blossomed into something that felt increasingly like the real thing. "Bram," Tilda began hesitantly, "when we married, when you offered to marry me, was it really just to protect me from their legal maneuvering?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were discovering them in the speaking. "At first, maybe. But standing there, watching you defend yourself with such courage and dignity, I realized I didn't want to lose you. Not to their schemes, not to anything. The marriage might have started as protection, But it became something real the moment I spoke those vows. Tilda felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from hopes fulfilled rather than dreams shattered. "I love you," she said simply. "Not gratitude, not dependence, love. The real thing. I love you too," Bram replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't think I could love anyone again after losing Sarah. But you've shown me that the heart has room for more than one great love in a lifetime." The admission hung between them like a bridge finally completed, connecting hearts that had been circling each other with careful respect and growing affection. They were no longer simply partners in survival or convenience. They were husband and wife in truth as well as law. But their newfound emotional security was threatened by forces gathering beyond their peaceful valley. Over the following weeks, visitors brought increasingly troubling news. Jake Morrison had indeed petitioned the territorial authorities, claiming evidence of fraud and coercion in their marriage. Worse, he had convinced several prominent citizens to support his allegations, painting himself as a concerned community member trying to protect a vulnerable woman from predatory behavior. "They're planning something," Samuel warned during another surreptitious visit. "Jake's been meeting with men from other towns, talking about the need for decisive action before winter makes the mountain passes impassable." Bram spent more time than usual checking and cleaning his father's rifle, the weapon that had defended 3 generations of Callister homesteads against both wild animals and wilder men. The rifle was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of his family's determination to protect what they had built, to stand their ground against any force that threatened their chosen way of life. As January approached, bringing with it news that a delegation was indeed forming to visit their mountain sanctuary, Bram and Tilda prepared for what might be the final confrontation with the forces that had shaped their past. They had found love and peace in their isolated valley, but the outside world was determined to drag them back into its web of judgment and cruelty. The storm clouds gathering over the mountain peaks seemed to mirror the human storm approaching from the valley below. Soon they would discover whether the life they had built together was strong enough to weather both. They came with the February thaw, when the mountain passes had cleared just enough to allow determined men with legal authority to make the treacherous journey. 8 riders this time, led not by Jake Morrison but by Marshal Wade Carrington, a territorial official whose very presence lent weight to accusations that might otherwise have been dismissed as small-town spite. Tilda saw them first from the kitchen window, where she stood kneading bread, her hands working the dough with the practiced efficiency she had developed over months of mountain living. Her mother's recipe book lay open beside her, its pages now stained with flour and marked with her own additions, adaptations learned through trial and success in this high-country kitchen. The familiar ritual of bread-making had become a meditation for her, a way of connecting with her mother's memory while creating sustenance for her own family. "Bram," she called, her voice steady despite the ice that formed in her veins as she recognized the purposeful approach of the riders. He appeared beside her within moments, his father's rifle already in his hands. The weapon was clean and ready, as it had been every day since Samuel's warnings had grown more urgent. The rifle represented more than protection. It was a symbol of 3 generations of Callister determination to defend what they had built against any force that threatened. Their chosen way of life, Marshal's badge, Bram observed grimly, his experienced eyes taking in the official nature of this delegation. They've brought the territorial law with them this time. The riders dismounted with military precision, their faces set in expressions of official determination that suggested this was no casual visit. Marshal Carrington was a lean man with steel-grey hair and eyes that suggested he had seen too much of humanity's darker impulses and learned to approach all situations with professional skepticism. Behind him came Jake Morrison, looking smug despite the cold that had reddened his cheeks during the long ride up the mountain. But it was the third figure that made Tilda's breath catch in her throat. Dr. Elias Thornfield, the territorial physician whose testimony could make or break their case. His presence suggested they had come not just to question, but to examine, to subject her to the kind of medical scrutiny that could either vindicate their marriage or destroy it entirely. The leather bag in his hands contained instruments she preferred not to think about. Tools that would reduce her to nothing more than evidence in a case she never asked to be part of. "Mr. and Mrs. Callister," Marshal Carrington called out as they emerged onto the front porch, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "I'm Marshal Wade Carrington, Territorial Authority for this district. I've come to investigate serious allegations regarding the circumstances of your marriage and the welfare of Mrs. Callister." Tilda stepped forward, her chin raised with the dignity she had learned in this mountain sanctuary. The woman who had once tried to make herself invisible now stood tall, occupying her space in the world without apology. "Marshal, I am Tilda Callister, and I am perfectly well and perfectly capable of speaking for myself. That remains to be determined." "Ma'am," the Marshal replied with professional courtesy that barely masked skepticism, "I've received sworn statements suggesting that your marriage was performed under duress to conceal improper relations, and that you may be suffering from mental impairment that prevents you from making rational decisions about your own welfare." The words hit like physical blows, each accusation designed to strip away the personhood she had reclaimed in this place. But Tilda had learned strength in these mountains, had discovered reserves of courage she never knew existed. The woman who had once absorbed such attacks in silence now had the tools to fight back. "Those statements are lies," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the valley with bell-like clarity. "Told by people who cannot bear to see me happy because it exposes the cruelty of their own treatment." Jake Morrison stepped forward with barely contained excitement, his face bright with the prospect of finally achieving his revenge. "Marshal, as you can see, the woman is clearly deluded. She's been isolated here for months, subjected to who knows what kind of psychological manipulation by a man with his own questionable motives." "I am standing right here," Tilda interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The interruption surprised even her. Months ago, she would never have dared to cut off a man speaking, regardless of what lies he was telling. "I am not deluded, not manipulated, and certainly not the helpless victim you're trying to paint me as. I am a grown woman who made a choice, the first real choice of my adult life, and I will not allow you to take it away from me." Dr. Thornfield consulted a leather portfolio, his expression clinical and detached, as if he were discussing livestock rather than a human being. "Mrs. Callister, I've been asked to conduct an examination to determine your mental competence and physical condition. Such an examination would settle these questions definitively and protect all parties involved from false accusations." The implication hung in the air like poison, and Tilda felt rage build in her chest. Not the helpless anger of someone being victimized, but the righteous fury of someone whose dignity was being attacked by people who had never shown her a moment's genuine concern. "You want to examine me like livestock," she said, her voice rising with each word as months of accumulated strength poured into her defense. "To poke and prod and measure, looking for evidence to support conclusions you've already reached. Well, I have news for you, Doctor. My body is my own, my mind is my own, and my choices are my own." She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew her mother's recipe book, holding it up like a shield against their accusations. The worn pages represented more than just cooking instructions. They were a tangible connection to a woman who had known how to love without conditions, how to see value where others saw only burden. "This book contains my mother's recipes, written in her own hand. Every page marked with love, every measurement seasoned with care. She taught me that a woman's worth isn't measured by what others think of her body, but by the strength of her character and the love in her heart." Tilda's voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the accumulated power of months spent discovering who she really was beneath the layers of other people's cruelty. The frightened girl who had been auctioned off as entertainment was gone. replaced by a woman who understood her own value and was prepared to defend it. I came to this mountain as someone broken, someone who had been told so often that I was worthless that I almost believed it. But Bram Callister saw something in me that no one else bothered to look for. Not my size, not my supposed weaknesses, but my strength. The strength to endure years of mockery without becoming cruel myself. The strength to keep my heart open despite constant rejection. The strength to build a life worth living when I was finally given the chance. Marshal Carrington held up a hand, trying to regain control of a situation that was clearly not proceeding as he had expected. Mrs. Callister, no one is questioning your personal worth, but there are legal procedures that must be followed. Yes, you are. Tilda cut him off, her interruption stunning the entire delegation into silence. You're questioning everything about me, everything about the life I've built, everything about the man who saw my worth when no one else would. You've ridden up here in winter weather, brought a doctor to examine me against my will, and treated my marriage like a crime that needs to be investigated. If that's not questioning my worth, then what would you call it? The power in Tilda's voice seemed to catch even Marshal Carrington off guard. This was not the cowering, confused woman Jake Morrison's statements had described. This was someone who had found her strength and was prepared to use it. Furthermore, Tilda continued, her voice ringing with authority that made the mountains themselves seem to lean in and listen. I have something to tell you that renders your entire investigation pointless. She reached behind her and pulled Bram's hand into hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy comfort of true partnership. When she spoke again, her words carried a joy so pure it seemed to transform the very air around them. I am carrying my husband's child. The silence that followed was so complete that Tilda could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the whisper of wind through the pine needles high above them. Jake Morrison's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, and finally a rage so pure it made him shake. That's impossible, he sputtered. The timing doesn't, you can't. I can and I am, Tilda said serenely. 3 months along, according to my mother's old books and the signs I've learned to recognize. Dr. Thornfield, if you insist on conducting your examination, you'll find clear evidence that I am not the victim you came here looking for, but a married woman expecting her first child. Bram's hand tightened on hers, his face transforming with wonder and something deeper, a joy that seemed to chase away the shadows that had lived in his eyes since Sarah's death. Tilda, he whispered, are you certain? As certain as sunrise, she replied, turning to meet his gaze with eyes that sparkled with happiness and fierce determination. I wanted to be sure before I told you. I wanted to be able to give you the news as a gift, not a worry. The delegation shifted uncomfortably, their carefully constructed case crumbling before their eyes. Her pregnant wife changed everything, made their accusations of coercion and fraud look not just wrong, but malicious. Marshal Carrington cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely from his grasp. Mrs. Callister, these are serious allegations that still require investigation. No, they don't. The voice that cut through the marshal's protests came from an unexpected source. Samuel Henley emerged from behind the cabin, flanked by 6 other men from Bitterhook, men who had made the difficult winter journey not to persecute, but to defend. Samuel, Bram said with surprise and gratitude, couldn't let them do this without someone speaking the truth, the old shopkeeper replied firmly. We've watched this young woman's transformation from the frightened girl who used to slip through town, trying to avoid notice, to the confident woman standing before us now. That's not the result of coercion or manipulation. That's what happens when someone finally receives the respect and kindness they deserve. Tom Wheeler, the town blacksmith, stepped forward with his hat in his hands. Marshal, I've known Tilda Mae, Mrs. Callister, since she was a child. Her mother was the kindest woman in Bitterhook, and her daughter has that same gentle strength. What Jake Morrison did at that festival was shameful, and what Mr. Callister did was decent. That's all there is to it. One by one, the men spoke up, neighbors who had witnessed years of casual cruelty, who had seen Tilda's quiet dignity in the face of constant mockery, who understood that what had happened in this mountain valley was not scandal but salvation. She was dying inside in that town, said Peter Hoffman, whose wife had sometimes shown Tilda small kindnesses. Not from any illness that could be treated with medicine, but from being told every day that she didn't matter. Look at her now. Tell me that's not a woman who's found where she belongs. Dr. Thornfield closed his portfolio with a sharp snap, his clinical detachment replaced by something that might have been shame. Marshal, I see no evidence of mental impairment or coercion. Mrs. Callister presents as a woman of sound mind and clear purpose. As for her physical condition, pregnancy would indeed explain certain signs that might otherwise have been misinterpreted. Jake Morrison's face had gone purple with frustrated rage. This is ridiculous. You can't just take her word. We can and we will, Marshal Carrington said firmly, clearly eager to extricate himself from what had become an embarrassing waste of territorial resources. The lady is married, pregnant, and clearly competent to make her own decisions. The matter is closed, but Tilda wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her hands still clasped in Bram's, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had finally found her power and intended to use it wisely. Jake Morrison, she said, and something in her tone made the young man fall silent despite himself. You came here today hoping to destroy the happiness I've found, to drag me back to a place where your entertainment mattered more than my dignity. But you've done something else instead. You've shown everyone exactly who you really are. She gestured to the men who had come to support her, to the marshal who was already preparing to leave, to the vast beauty of the mountains that surrounded them all. These good men came here in winter weather to defend something decent against something ugly. They risked the journey, not because they had to, but because they chose to. That's the difference between you and them. Jake, they understand that a person's worth isn't determined by how much entertainment they provide for others. The wedding quilt she had been secretly working on during the long winter evenings was folded in her arms now, pulled from its hiding place to serve as evidence of her intentions, her commitment, her vision of the future she and Bram were building together. This quilt represents my promise, she said, holding it up for all to see. Not just to my husband, but to the family we're creating, to the life we're building in this place where love matters more than cruelty. Spring came early to the mountain valley that year, as if the earth itself was eager to celebrate new life and fresh beginnings. The wildflowers that carpeted the meadow seemed more vibrant than ever before, painted in brilliant yellows and deep purples that caught the morning light like scattered jewels. Tilda stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting on her growing belly, watching Bram work in his shop behind the cabin. The rhythmic sound of his hammer on wood had become the soundtrack of their days, not the desperate work of a man trying to outrun his grief, but the purposeful labor of someone building toward a future he could finally envision. In the months since the confrontation with the territorial authorities, Bram had returned to the unfinished cradle with steady hands and a heart ready to hope again. The new cradle was different from the one he had carved for Sarah, broader, sturdier, designed for the robust child that mountain living would require. But it incorporated elements from the original design. The carved roses that had represented his first dreams of fatherhood, now blended with new motifs that spoke of second chances and love that could grow from the ashes of sorrow. It's beautiful, Tilda said when he brought it inside for her inspection, the wood glowing with the kind of finish that could only come from patient, loving work. It's ready, Bram replied. And they both understood he meant more than just the furniture. He was ready to be a father, ready to love without the paralyzing fear of loss, ready to trust that the future could hold joy as well as sorrow. Their child was born on a morning in late June, when the mountain air was sweet, with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Dr. Thornfield attended the birth, not as a skeptical investigator, but as a friend who had traveled from town specifically to ensure the safe delivery of the baby whose very existence had vindicated his parents' love. "A son," he announced as he placed the squalling infant in Tilda's arms. "Strong lungs, good color, and every sign of perfect health." Tilda looked down at her son's wrinkled face, seeing in his features a blend of her own gentle strength and Bram's quiet determination. This child would grow up knowing he was wanted, knowing he was loved, knowing that his parents had fought for their right to create a family built on respect and mutual care. "James," she said softly, naming him for her father, who had died when she was young, but who lived on in her memories of kindness and patient strength. "James Samuel Callister." Bram's eyes filled with tears as he touched his son's tiny hand, feeling the miracle of new life and new hope. "Hello, James," he whispered. "Welcome to your mountain." The visitors from town began arriving the next day. Samuel Henley, with a wooden toy horse he had carved specially for the baby. Tom Wheeler with a tiny set of horseshoes made from silver, and a parade of neighbors who had traveled the difficult mountain roads, not out of duty, but out of genuine affection for the family that had shown them what courage looked like. Even Sheriff Hendrik made the journey, not in any official capacity, but as a man who had recognized the difference between law and justice, between what was legal and what was right. He brought news that Jake Morrison had left Bitterhook for parts unknown, his reputation so damaged by the failed persecution that even his father's money could not restore his standing in the community. "Good riddance," was Samuel's blunt assessment. "Some people are poison, and the community's healthier without them." As summer deepened into autumn, Tilda found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been the town's favorite target, a woman so beaten down by constant mockery that she had almost forgotten her own worth. Now she stood in her own kitchen, preparing meals for her own family, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love and mutual respect. The transformation was visible in everything from her confident posture to the way she hummed her mother's songs while she worked. But the deepest change was internal, a quiet certainty that she deserved happiness, that her voice mattered, that she had valuable contributions to make to the world. "Do you ever miss it?" Bram asked one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching James sleep peacefully in his father's arms. "Town life? Having neighbors close by?" Tilda considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had become her hallmark. "I miss the good parts," she said finally. "I miss my mother, and I miss the idea of community that cares for its members instead of using them for entertainment. But I don't miss being afraid every time I stepped outside, and I don't miss making myself small to avoid drawing attention." She looked out over the valley that had become their sanctuary, noting how the evening light painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "This place taught me that I could be large, not just in body, but in spirit, in purpose, in the love I have to give. I learned that I don't have to apologize for taking up space in the world." Bram shifted James to one arm so he could take Tilda's hand with his free one. "You take up exactly the right amount of space," he said. "Not too little, not too much, but exactly what the world needs from Tilda Callister." As winter approached once again, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of mountain life, their small family prepared for the challenges and joys ahead. The pantry was full of Tilda's preserves, the woodshed stacked with fuel for the long, cold months, and the cradle ready for a child who would grow up knowing that love could triumph over cruelty, that dignity could be reclaimed, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the darkness before dawn. On the first snowy evening of the season, as they sat before their fire with James sleeping peacefully between them, Tilda opened her mother's recipe book to add a new entry. In careful script that echoed her mother's handwriting, she wrote, "Recipe for happiness, take 2 wounded hearts, add equal measures of respect and kindness, season generously with patience and understanding, allow time and gentle care to work their magic. Serves a lifetime with love enough to share.